Okay, so what are we learning? We began by talking about the fact that there are two characters, two personalities, and they have this major head-to-head as described in the Torah, the two personalities being not our forefather, the son of Yaakov, Yehuda. Yehuda is the head of the tribe that eventually would be the tribe of kings, and his brother, Yosef, the head of a different tribe. And that's actually what the conflict, is partially about, is that Yehuda is supposed to be the king. So what on earth is Yosef up to? Yosef comes along and he wants to be the king. So it's for that reason that the brothers and Yosef didn't see eye to eye initially, and the brothers sell him to slavery, and he goes down to Egypt. Fast forward a couple of decades, and now the Jews are in trouble. There's no food, and they need to go down to Egypt in order to get food. The brothers arrive over there, and Yosef, who they don't recognize as their brother, he's the person in charge of providing the food. And it becomes a whole interesting give and take, until eventually, where we are in the story, is where Yosef has taken Binyamin as a captive, accusing him of terrible things, accusing him of stealing, accusing him of disrespect to the authorities. And now Yehuda, who had taken personal responsibility for the safe return of his brother, goes face to face with Yosef, and he says, you got to let my brother go. Got to let my brother go. So what's interesting to us is that when you start to explore the mystical perspective on this particular story, you discover that we're told in the Zohar that this engagement, this face-to-face, this challenge that Yehuda gives to Yosef is somehow related to davening. That in the course of davening, you have to do you have to be soimeich geula litfila. That the part of the davening which is go al Yisrael, you bless Hashem for the fact that He took us out of Egypt, that has to be directly next to the brachas of the Amidah. And so we want to say that there's a correlation between the two. Somehow Yosef is associated with the one theme, the theme of Geula, and Yehuda is associated with the theme of Tefillah, of davening, of prayer. Just to make it more interesting, we also learned that Yehuda and Yosef represent two different dynamics of the spiritual system. The way that Hashem creates the world and the way that Hashem runs the world is by investing these 10 different types of energies into the world. They are called the 10 Sephiros, 10 different dynamics of divine input. And in the 10 different dynamics, in the 10 different Sephiros, there are two Sephiros that work close together but are very different to each other. One is called Yesod, and one is called Malchus. Now, it's always easier for us to try and understand spiritual concepts by exploring how those concepts play out in our lives. Once we understand it on a personal level, it becomes that much easier to relate it to how it is in the spiritual reality. So in our lives, we have the experience of internal works, the experience of how I feel about things, the attitudes that I have, the responses that I have towards things. That is what we call midos, my personal responses to the things that are going on in my life. And I could have the most intense midos that exist, and nobody will know about them. So it's possible, for example, for somebody to be absolutely enamored with a particular idea, and they've never shared it with anybody else. Or conversely, a person may have a tremendous anxiety around something, and nobody knows about it because they've never communicated it. So the entire experience of what we call midos occurs internally. In order for midos to reach the outside, in order to convey, to communicate, and to share, you first have to create a bridge. You've got to create the bridge between how you feel and how you'll communicate it to somebody else. And the capacity to do that is called Yesod. So in human experience, Yesod is the bridge between what I'm feeling and how I'm going to share it with somebody else, which obviously is related to who I feel is appropriate to share it with. In Hashem's reality, Yesod would be the bridge between Hashem's capacity for creation and His actual creation. Because, of course, Hashem has potential to create without end. So how does that translate into actually creating? Well, that's going to require a bridge, and that bridge is called Yesod. When you open your mouth and you, in fact, begin to communicate, you actually start to talk to somebody else, that requires the element called Malchus. Malchus, which translates directly as royalty or leadership, is very much about communication, because if a person wants to be an effective leader, the key is to be able to communicate. And if a person wants to be the king of an entire country, the way that the king relates to the citizens of the country is through speaking. So Malchus is that element of now you've actually translated what you were thinking and feeling on the inside into a communication that you're in fact sharing with somebody else. So Yesod and Malchus effectively correspond to two very different parts of the experience, both of the human experience and of the divine experience. Yesod is my internal process of looking to bridge with someone or something else, and Malchus is when I actually cross that bridge. Yosef represents the concept of Yesod, and we'll have to still see how and why that is, and Yehuda represents the concept of Malchus, which is obvious because he's the father of kings. So now what we're seeing is that this idea of Geula and Tefillah coming together is somehow compared to Yosef and Yehuda coming face to face, and that doesn't seem to make sense. Because in the story, Yosef, who represents Yesod, is sitting in a position of power, and he's the one who is going to control whether or not they get food. So Yehuda, who represents Malchus, is in a weaker position where he now has to approach Yosef, and he has to petition Yosef, please let my brother go. So Yosef has the power, and Yehuda goes towards the one with the power. Whereas when we talk about davening, Shmona Esrei Amida, that is Malchus. So that's the center of power. That's the main part of the davening. And then the brocha that carries the theme of Geula, of redemption, is secondary and has to be brought closer to the davening. So which way is it? Is the objective to bring Malchus towards Yesod, or is the objective to bring Yesod towards Malchus? And effectively that describes a deeper question. What is the main source of power? Is the main source of power that which occurs internally, outside of what anybody else could know and understand? Put it in Hashem's reality. Where's the real power? In Hashem's pristine self and how Hashem engages from his perspective, like the story of Yosef sitting on the throne? Or is the real power in Malchus? Is the real power once I step out of myself and I communicate with somebody else? Or is the real power in the world that Hashem has created rather than in the creator? Like in the story of davening, where you want to bring the Geula and plug it into the Tefillah. So that's what we have to understand. And last week we left off by saying that before we could understand this, we needed to know one other very important piece of the history of Yosef. And that piece of the history of Yosef is the fact that when Yosef, prior to becoming the king and all that kind of stuff, when Yosef was still in the field together with his brothers, so what happened at that point was Yosef had a dream, and his dream was that all of the brothers were going to bundle up sheaves of wheat, and then they were going to come to Yosef and bow to Yosef. Why is that? So now we're understanding that on a deeper level, gathering sheaves of wheat basically means this. Each stalk of wheat is completely separate from each different stalk of wheat. So that is a good metaphor for the world that we live in. Everything seems to be completely independent of everything else. Now, to be Jewish means to make sense of everything that's independent of everything else. To be Jewish means to bring it all into a state of coalescence, to bring it into synthesis, to bring it into harmony. How do you bring the diversity of our world into harmony? With one guiding principle, which is the world is here in order to connect to Hashem. So that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to bring everything together to connect to Hashem. So being out in the field, last week we learned that the field is not a place of human habitat. So being out in the field implies being outside of the spiritual arena. You go out into the world, you pick up the stalks, individual stalks of wheat, you bind them all together to become something meaningful which can now be presented to Hashem. Or in simple English, how do I use the world as a way to serve Hashem? Now the brothers were very engaged with that process. What Yosef told them and what upset them a lot was, before you, as these incredible people who have this amazing ability to transform the world, before you can actually complete your process, you have to bring your spiritual progress to me and I'll finish the job. And they didn't like that. What do you mean you're going to finish the job? So once we examine that principle in greater detail, we'll start to understand what's happening over here in our particular story. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the second paragraph. We did begin it last week. We didn't complete it. So in order to understand what's going on, let's go back to the beginning of the second paragraph. So the summary of the explanation of the Yehuda Yosef dynamic, as is explained in various places in Chassidus, we'll focus on one place in particular, based on the discourse where the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, explains the verse of Yosef's dream, saying, I saw us all bundling up these sheaves of wheat in the field. What does it mean? Says the Alter Rebbe, that effectively what was happening over here is that the Shvatim, the brothers, had to go through an experience called birur. Birur means when you refine. So for example, if you mine gold, what comes out of the shaft is big chunks of rock, gold ore. Most of that is not useful. So what you have to do is you have to crush it down, and you have to go through a refinery process in order to extract the gold and get rid of all the rubbish. That's called birur. Now, the fact that Hashem designed our world in such a way that you have to mine through tons and tons of material that you don't need in order to find a few grams of the material that you do need, and that is then considered precious material. So the fact that Hashem has designed that as part of our world is to help us to understand and to appreciate that that's how it is in spiritual terms too. So in spiritual terms, what happens is most of the world is just stuff. And we, as Jewish people, go take that stuff and extract out of it the few milligrams of spiritual meaning. So the best example of this would be food or business. So let's say business. Hours and hours and hours that a person invests of their time and of their energy and of their intellectual capital to be able to try and get their business off the ground. Why does a Jewish person have a business? To facilitate doing mitzvahs. So firstly, I have money that I can give to tzedakah, and I have money that I can put a beautiful Shabbos together and have guests in my house. But even besides that, the particular product that I'm involved in needs to have a way to be able to express mitzvah and holiness in this world. And the meetings that I have with people, whether they be suppliers, whether they be customers, the marketing team, whoever it is, each one of those interactions is supposed to be an opportunity to bring more holiness into the world. So that's refinement that we're talking about, gathering up from all this disparate stalks of the world a bundle of a cohesive message of connection to Hashem. So after the Shvatim, after the brothers go through that process in their own lives, trying to bring some holiness out of the world into a state of connection to God, then they need to go through a second refinement, and Yosef is the one who affects that second refinement, and we need to understand what it is. So here we're going to explain. In order to understand this paragraph, you might remember from the first class that we had on this Maimer, so we learned that there were a few different phrases that we'd have to be familiar with in order to decode this Maimer. And one of those sets of phrases was the terms ma and ban. Ma is a representation of a particular way of spelling out Hashem's name that brings you to a gematria value of 45. And ban represents a different way of spelling out Hashem's name that brings you to a gematria value of 52. What's relevant to us is that ma represents a divine approach from above downwards. In other words, bringing holiness into the world from its source. Whereas ban represents a process of lifting and elevating the world to be able to connect to God. Now both are valuable and both are valid. In order for us to have a meaningful relationship between ourselves, our world, and Hashem, we have to have both ma and ban. We have to have flow of energy into this world, what you and I would call inspiration. And we have to have work to take the world and lift it, and that's what you and I would call perspiration. So you have ma and ban. When the tzaddikim are out there in the field and they're trying to transform the world into a place of holiness, what they're basically doing is ban. They're saying, here's a packet of materialism. So this package of materialism might be food. This package of materialism might be business. And what I want to do is I want to take something out of there and lift it up. So when I sit down to a meal, the vast majority of people who sit down to a meal have only one intention, and that is to enjoy themselves. Oh, maybe they'll also be conscious of the fact that there's an element of nutrition. Maybe, but why do I eat? Because I enjoy eating. At the end of the day, that's why I eat. A Jewish person says, why do I eat? Because now it's an opportunity to bless Hashem before I eat. It's an opportunity to bless Hashem after I eat. And whatever nutrients I can take from that food to get energy to be able to do another mitzvah, that will make the eating experience worthwhile. So that's called ban. I start off in a place that is low. I start off in a place that is materialistic. And I try to climb a ladder out of that place and say, I'm not just going to have a materialistic experience. I'm actually going to have a mindful experience, going to have a meaningful experience. So that's what I'm trying to do. Now that is the biru zehu rak bitul hayesh. In the language of Hasidus, we call this degree of refinement, this experience, we call it bitul hayesh. Now bitul hayesh is a very interesting concept. In order to understand this concept, let's first break it apart into two words. Let's first look at the word bittul. What does bittul mean? Okay, so the best way to understand bittul from a Torah perspective is the classic kashrut kitchen nightmare. Okay, what's the classic kashrut kitchen nightmare? Is you turn around and you discover that you had a kosher kitchen and then something happened. Somebody mixed something with an item or a foodstuff that it should never have mixed with. So let's say, for argument's sake, you're preparing a wonderful cholent for Shabbos, and somehow or other, somebody wasn't paying attention, and straight after mixing their coffee, they decided they wanted to taste the cholent. So they took the spoon straight out of the coffee, which was made with milk, and they used the same spoon into your cholent to scoop out a piece of cholent and to be able to taste it for Shabbos. Now, we're not going to analyze what happened to the cholent that they ate. Our question is, what's the story with the rest of the cholent that's left in the pot? Because now milk has gone into my meat pot, and I'm not allowed to mix meat and milk. So halachically, what is the status? Now, it's not as if somebody dropped in a big glob of cheese, because that would be a different question. Obviously, before I could even ask anything, halachically, I got to get the cheese out. But because we're dealing over here with a liquid, there is no option of removing the actual milk out of the cholent, because now it's going to just mix in with the rest of the liquid of the cholent, and it's going to be gone. So the question is, halachically, do I now have a problem on my hands? Now, if you were studying for your smicha, for your rabbinic ordination, so then the rabbi who asked this question set you up already right from the beginning, because the question is specifically about stirring coffee, which means how much of the coffee is actually milk. Most people are thinking how much of what came from the coffee cup went into the cholent. The question is how much of what was in the spoon was milk. It was a mixture between milk and water and coffee. So even before it got into the cholent, it was already a lesser amount than what I thought. So now I need to know the principle of bittul. Is there enough mass of cholent to override the mass of milk? That is the question. And the rule that we use is 60-1. So if I know that there's 60 times more volume of cholent than there is of milk, then the milk is botel. The milk is technically no longer there. Now, if I had to take a sample of this cholent and put it under a microscope, I might be able to find particles of milk. But the halacha does not require me to look under a microscope. The halacha requires that I use a formula. And the formula says that if there is 60 times more meat than this milk that went in, or 60 times more cholent than this milk that went in, it is bottle. It is as if it hasn't existed. It's as if it doesn't have any impact on the cholent. Now, that is called bitul hayesh. The identity, that's what yesh implies. The identity of the milk has now been negated by the overwhelming identity of the cholent. Make sense? Here's another way of looking at it. Let's say that you stood in a crowd. Let's say that the crowd was at a concert or at a sports event, and there are 20,000 people in the crowd. Somebody, let's say you're in a stadium. Somebody takes a picture from the other side of the stadium of the crowd. Can you now take issue with them and say, I did not give you permission to share my picture? Because obviously they take the picture and they share it on social media. Can you say to them, I did not give you permission to share my picture? You can't. Why? Because when anybody looks at the picture, they won't see you. Because there are 10,000 people on that side of the stadium and you're completely blurred in the crowd. So you have what we call bitul hayesh. Your identity is completely lost in that identity. The sea of people is so overwhelming that you, individual, you don't stick out. You'll say, but because they used an HD camera, if you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, you will actually be able to see me. Okay, fair point. If anybody is that obsessed with you that they're going to look through some strangest photos and zoom in to find you in the crowd of 10,000 people, you may have different problems than this particular guy's social media post. So what is Bitul Hayesh? Bitul Hayesh means that the environment is so powerful that it negates the individual identity. But does that mean that the individual does not have an identity? Not at all. The individual certainly does have an identity. It's just now overwhelmed by the environment. Let's translate that into the example of either eating or doing business. So a person's eating, right? And the person sits down and it's breakfast and you're having whatever it is that you have for breakfast. Some really healthy breakfast. I don't know, sliced fruit and yogurt and muesli, whatever it is that you're having for breakfast, okay? So the reason I'm using a healthy example is because then you can really, with honesty and integrity, say, I want these nutrients in my system so that I can have the energy to be able to serve Hashem. So when a person serves Hashem now, having used that breakfast, is the yogurt no longer yogurt? Is the muesli no longer muesli? Of course it is. It's just been redefined. Its purpose has been redefined in a bigger picture. So the first stage of refinement is called Bitul Hayesh. Let's take something and change or get rid of its original definition and give it a new meaningful definition. It used to be just for the sake of enjoyment. Why do you eat this breakfast? Because you love it. Why do you eat this breakfast now? Because you're serving Hashem. But that's not enough. Because in fact, the brothers were very successful in lifting the world that they lived in to be more connected to Hashem. They still needed Yosef to come and take it over the finish line. Why? Because they needed birur b'derech milmayla lemato, birur dema. Because what Yosef would bring to the picture is another kind of refinement, one that comes by introducing energy that is higher and greater than the world that we live in, through which the sparks of holiness that we were able to discover in the world could actually be lifted and completely encompassed and integrated into holiness. Let's look at it this way. Imagine you're refining this gold ore. So you've got this massive chunk of gold ore. And now you've got to get the gold nuggets out of the ore. That's called birur rishon. It's a very arbitrary and very, so to speak, what's the word? It takes a tremendous amount of effort, getting the gold out of the stone. Now, once you've gotten the gold out of the stone, is it automatically jewelry? No. So the miner has to take the gold nuggets that he's succeeded in extracting out of the stone, and he has to hand that over to a jeweler whose expertise is to take this gold and turn it into something beautiful. He's got to bring expertise into the picture. He's got to bring skill that is beyond the skill set of the miners into the picture to be able to turn a block of gold into a piece of jewelry. That's Yosef. Yosef is the spiritual artisan. Yosef has to bring another set of skills into the space to say, yes, it's very good. You've pried away the potential spirituality out of the materialism. You've done that. You've said, we're now going to use the energy of this food to serve God. So you've pulled it out of the heaviness of materialism and you've made it available to spirituality. Says Yosef, my job is now to inspire you with the spirituality so that the energy that you've taken from the food can actually be directed to and connected with Hashem. So what do we have at this point? We have two directions in the process of refining, elevating, and transforming our world. We have the ban direction, which is take the world and lift it a notch. And we have the ma approach and direction, which is to say, oh, look, you've started to elevate the world. Let me get involved over there. Let me help you to take it to a whole different level. All right, here comes the tricky part. So the Alter Rebbe then explains, in order to get that finished product, first what you need some kind of petition, some kind of interest from the ban to initiate the ma. What does that mean? Let's go back to the example of the miner. So, what's the jeweler going to do? Is the jeweler going to stick around at the mine waiting for gold to become available so that he could turn it into jewelry? Not at all. The jeweler is going to stay in his studio. And he's going to wait until he gets the message from the miner, where the miner is going to say, okay, look, I've done my part. I've extracted the gold from the ore. Now I need you to please come along and take it to the next level. Which means two things. Firstly, it means that the miner has to acknowledge that he doesn't have the know-how and he needs the help of the jeweler. Second of all, he has to express that need, because how else is the jeweler supposed to know that the gold nuggets are now available to be designed and crafted into jewelry? Same thing. Yes, it's true that Yosef is going to do something with the spiritual achievements of his brothers that they themselves couldn't do. But Yosef is not in the field. Remember, that's one of the points of contention between Yosef and his brothers. They're always in the field. He's never in the field. They feel that he's spoiled. They feel that his father has given him way too much leeway, and he should be getting his hands dirty like everybody else. That's what they believe, because they don't begin to appreciate Yosef's perspective. So they're out in the field. Yosef is not in the field. They're the miners. He is the jeweler. He's the artisan. Until such time as they recognize that they need his help, they'll never tell him that they're ready for his help, and he'll never help them. As long as the miner thinks that the purpose of mining gold is that we should have pieces of gold that just sit as lumps of gold, if that's how he thinks, we'll never have jewelry in the world. So at some point, he's going to have to transition, and he's going to reach a point to say, okay, I know my limitations. I defer. I don't know what to do with these nuggets of jewelry, these nuggets of gold. So I'm going to ask you to come along and do something. Now, that's where Yosef butted heads with his brothers, because he keeps telling them, guys, you're going to have to come to me and I'll help you over to the next level of spiritual development. And they keep saying, what are you talking about? Who do you think you are? You know something, you could do something that we cannot do. They found that objectionable. And that's why there was tension between them. But what's his dream? His dream is, his dream is you're going to have to bow down. You're going to have to submit to me. Which is basically to say, you're going to have to reach out to me. That's called alas man, elevating, so to speak, energy from the lower to the higher realm. In simple terms, you're going to have to reach out to me. If you don't reach out to me, I will never be able to give you the energy that you need to translate all of your spiritual efforts into what Hashem really expects of them. It's only because of and thanks to the brothers being willing, which they initially were not able to do, being willing to admit their own limitations, being willing to accept that they need Yosef to guide them. Until that happens, Yosef's hands are tied. He cannot impose his will on them. He cannot stick his face into theirs and say, you need to do X and Y. So effectively what we're seeing over here is a very interesting system. And the system has a whole series of dynamics to it. The system requires 3 steps. The first step that the system requires is ordinary people, represented here by the brothers, you and I, to be invested in our physical world with a spiritual objective. That is step 1. Step 1 is that we should not earn money just so we could have wealth. We should not eat food just so we could appreciate its taste. We should not wear nice clothing so people will comment on how amazing our fashion sense is. Step 1 is that we as ordinary people should realize that we need to do work so that we can have money so we can serve Hashem. We need to eat so we can have energy to serve Hashem. We need to dress in such a way that will attract other people to want to be part of our mission to serve Hashem. That's step 1, recognizing that the goal of life is not to live in the world, but to live using the world as a catalyst for growth. Now, we're also ordinary people, so we don't actually know exactly how that growth should all pan out. And we don't really know how to reach the ultimate state that growth could take us to. So for that, we always need a Yosef personality. We need some kind of a tzaddik in our lives who reaches out to us and says, okay, let me take you beyond that. I think what you've done is amazing. And now I'm going to inspire you with insight that you would never have had on your own. And I'm going to give you things that you should do that you would never have thought of your own. And through that, you'll get to a level you could never have achieved on your own. But a tzaddik cannot dictate. A tzaddik cannot impose. A tzaddik cannot walk into our lives and say, here's what you need to do, until such time as we've created the space for him. So step one of the process is our work. Step two of the process, which is the critical step, is acknowledging at some point that our work has reached its max. And now we need to petition the tzaddik to help us to go further. And then, step three, the tzaddik begins to help and begins to inspire. Now, it's not even as simple as that. Because where are we supposed to know this from? Think about it. If I was told, as all of us were told, that my job in this world is to do mitzvahs and to serve God, then I'm going to go out there and I'm going to do mitzvahs and serve God. Now you're telling me something I didn't know, which is that not only am I supposed to do mitzvahs and serve God, and not only am I supposed to engage with the world and try and transform it into some means of higher connection, but I also need a tzaddik in the picture who's going to inject me with some spiritual impetus that I wouldn't have had on my own. How am I supposed to know that? How am I supposed to know who to go to? How am I supposed to identify the right tzaddik? How am I supposed to know what I do when I do identify that tzaddik? How am I supposed to know what I'm supposed to present him with? So therefore, there has to be a fourth part of the system. There has to be some coaxing on the tzaddik's part. So if we really want to look at it, the system has 4 steps. Step number 1, the ordinary person does their level best to serve Hashem with the materials at their disposal. Level 2, the tzaddik reaches out to them and says, hey, you know what? There's value in connecting to a tzaddik. Step 3 is I say, oh, really? I want to do that. How do I do that? Step 4, the tzaddik says, now that you've shown an interest, let me help you. But the tzaddik does have to coach us because we're not going to necessarily know how to do it on our own. Now let's read that concept in mystical terminology. V'hina yodua, it is well known, in order to initiate the yearning and the reach of ban, which is the part of godliness that is engaged with the world, trying to lift the world. In order to get that process to also feel the need to connect to something higher than itself, that also requires some initiation that starts from above. So we're using the names Ban and Ma to represent 2 dynamics of the divine energy, but they translate into very relatable terms the 2 dynamics of how we serve Hashem. In order for me to be stimulated, to want to find a tzaddik who's going to help me to elevate my game, the tzaddik actually has to first poke his head into my space and say, you actually need this. Now with this information that we're seeing that there are 4 parts to the system: human endeavor, a so to speak, hinting or initiating by the tzaddik that you need more than just human endeavor. Then the response of the ordinary person to say, please let me have some of that. And then finally the tzaddik's input. That plays out in the story of Yehuda and Yosef. This is what the Zohar means when it tells us the Zohar told us that when Yehuda approached Yosef, that was the same spiritual dynamic that we're supposed to replicate every single day in our prayers by putting the brocha, Goal Yisrael, right next to the Amidah. And we asked the question, we said, but hang on a second, that seems to be contradictory directions, because we thought there were only 2 parts to the process. That's why we thought either the process goes from the bottom up or the process goes from the top down. But now that we're starting to see that there are 4 steps to the process, then we see that the process goes from the bottom up, then from the top down, then from the bottom up again, and then from the top down again. So how does that all work? The Hagashas Yehuda Yosef, who last man the Ashvatim Yehuda who Ikra Ashvatim Yosef. When Yehuda approaches Yosef in the story, now if you read the story at face value, the reason he's approaching Yosef is because he really needs Yosef to release his baby brother. That's why he's approaching him. But we do know that the Torah tells us the same story on multiple layers simultaneously. So that means that Yehuda, who in a certain sense represents all the other brothers, why in a certain sense? Because he's their king. So he's the main person of the brothers. So Yehuda approaching Yosef represents the ordinary person trying to gain the attention of the tzaddik so that the tzaddik will help them to be able to elevate their spirituality. So to put it into the language that we're using over here with all this complex Kabbalistic language, we want the man, which is Mayin Nukvin, the so-called feminine waters, which basically means any process that is initiated from the bottom up, which in turn should stimulate a reciprocal process called Mad, Mayin Dechurin, which is masculine waters, representing any process that initiates from the top down. So this might sound all a little bit abstract to us. Let's talk about it in language we could relate to. Let's say that you have a teacher and a student. Now, in the teacher-student relationship, you expect that the teacher is always the one giving to the student. That's the role. So the teacher has to share information, the teacher has to share insight, the teacher has to provide lesson plans, the teacher has to give the homework. So it's the job of the teacher to assist the student. At the same time, though, not every student will necessarily get the same input from the same teacher. And the reason for that is because some students will show more initiative than others. Those students who show initiative, it is a natural response from a teacher. Oh, you're interested? Let me help you more. So, the student's interest is what we call Mayin Nukvin, the so-called feminine water. That means the one who is on the receiving end shows interest in wanting to receive more. That stimulates the teacher, who represents Mayin Dechurin, the masculine energy, to say, oh, you're interested, in that case I'll give you more. Yehuda approaches Yosef. We now know that in the story Yehuda represents the so-called ordinary person whose job it is to try as best as possible to lift the world from its materialistic status quo into a state of spiritual connection and holiness. That's Yehuda, representing the ordinary person. We now know that Yosef represents the tzaddik. The tzaddik being the individual who can imbue into that process something beyond what the process already or would naturally ever have. But we're seeing an interesting dynamic. Yehuda has to approach Yosef, and then Yosef switches on. In our story, Yehuda approaches Yosef, and he says, please let my brother go. And what does it switch on? Yosef says, right, now I'm willing to tell you who I really am, and I'm your brother, and I care about you, and everything is by divine ordination, and that's why we're here, and don't worry, because now you're sorted for the rest of the period of the famine, you don't have to worry ever again. It's the same principle. The Mayin Nukvin stimulates the Mayin Dechurin. The movement from below, the ordinary person showing an interest, stimulates a response from the super powerful person. Look what it says parenthetically. What's fascinating is that there are different opinions about what the word Vayigash means. And Rashi quotes specifically the opinion that says that Vayigash is an expression of peace. Now, you don't get that from the story because it actually seems like Yehuda is being confrontational. And yet, they tell us it's an expression of peace. Why? It's because the difference between being the miner and being the jeweler is that mining is a very difficult type of labor that requires a tremendous amount of challenge and risk. Whereas being a jeweler is a very beautiful experience that requires less physical input, requires better skills, but less physical input, and it requires almost no risk. It's shalom, it's peaceful. So when Yehuda and his brothers are out there in the field, working in the field, that's not a peaceful experience, it's a challenging experience. But by the time they come to Yosef, and by the time they stimulate Yosef's involvement, and now there's the input of the tzaddik, the entire experience of trying to elevate and lift our world becomes a more pleasant and more peaceful experience. And that we'll have to unpack in more detail, please God, next week.